Hey everybody, welcome back to the Optometry Money Podcast, where we're helping ODs all over the country make better and better decisions with their money, their careers, and their practices. I am your host, Evon, certified financial planning practitioner and owner of Optometry Wealth Advisors, an independent financial planning firm just for optometrists nationwide. And thank you so much for listening. Really appreciate your time and your attention today. On today's episode, we have Dr. Kerry Reeves, owner of Advanced Eye Care with locations in North and South Carolina. Kerry unpacks how optometry doesn't have a growth problem, it has a capacity problem. And we dive into how important systems are to running a smooth optometry practice, how optometrists can find and fix the bottlenecks in their practice to improve capacity, and how dependency on the owner causes fragility and impacts the value of your practice. And finally, we wrap up with AI. We talk about how optometry will be impacted by and be able to use artificial intelligence. And I'll throw all the links and resources we mentioned in our show notes, which you can find at our education hub at our website, www.optometrywealth.com. Reach out if you have any questions. And without further ado, here is my conversation with Kerry Reeves. Welcome back to the Optometry Money Podcast. I am excited to welcome onto the podcast Dr. Kerry Reeves. Kerry, thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, thanks for having me. For sure. Excited.
I'm excited to talk with you about operations and capacity and improving capacity within optometry practices. But before we dive into all that fun stuff, I want to get to learn a little bit more about you and your practice. Tell us, you've got a few things you're working on, right? Just looking through your presence online. You have your practice, Advanced Eye Care in North and South Carolina. It looks like you're working on a patient engagement platform in iCoin. You have a skincare line with your wife, and you're working on a lot of really interesting things. Tell us about your background. What got you into optometry? What led you to practicing where you are now? And tell us about your practice.
All right. It kind of turns out that I just realized this week that the group of students that are graduating and going into practice may not have been born when I started practicing. It's the first year that I am been practicing longer than they have been born. And so that was an awakening moment for me. So yeah, I just started off doing this about 27 years ago and came out of optometry school, went to UAB, went into private practice in Newton, North Carolina, a little Main Street type practice with a optometrist that had been there for 40 years. And he had a junior partner, and then I came in and did that for about 10 years. And just through some crazy stuff, we sold everything and moved to Haiti and started doing optometry down there, where we were setting up clinics throughout the country where they didn't have any clinics. And then 6 months after we moved is when the earthquake hit in 2010. And so that changed everything. And so it's been about 5 years down there doing that, mostly changed from just optometry to earthquake recovery. And then after that, moved back to the U.S. I have a lot of kids. We have 8 kids total. 4 of them are adopted, and a couple of them had some learning stuff that we couldn't do down there. So we moved back to the U.S. We moved back to Florida, where we had a little condo, but I didn't have an optometry license in Florida. And so I didn't know what I was going to do. I actually applied to be an RV salesman and didn't get hired for that. And then I started working as a tech at Florida Eye Institute. So I worked as a tech for an ophthalmology group until we figured things out. And then I ended up moving to Georgia, where I'm from, and spent 5 years working with a cataract surgeon. Learned a whole lot working in ophthalmology with him. And then end of 2018, we moved back to North Carolina. I bought a practice up here in Fayetteville, North Carolina, to be closer to kids and grandkids. I have a grandchild number 7 being born this week.
My goodness.
Wow. And one more later in the summer. So I'll have 8 kids and 8 grandkids by the end of the summer. And so moved back up here to be closer to them. And then we since then have added a practice in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina as well. And that's our optometry practice side, is we're in Fayetteville, North Carolina, Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. And then we do the whole iCoin thing has been really an engaging, fun adventure of building a software program for patient follow through to try to improve follow through. You know how talk to patients I come up with this great diagnosis, man. I did great job on all my stuff, and I thought I educated them good and had them all pumped about doing what I recommended. And then 3 months later, they hadn't done nothing. It's not any better. They've not used the drops, or they're not following through on the myopia stuff. And we're developing a software program to help improved follow through, patient engagement and follow through. So that's been exciting. Learned a whole lot about what I didn't know about software and stuff. So that's been exciting. And then just really working with systems. I got into systems when we lived in Haiti because everything there is broken. System you can imagine is broken. And so we had to create our own electricity, pump our own water, do everything. And then also just with the education, with the economics, started looking at systems. And then when I moved back to the US, I began to realize a lot of what my issues were in optometry were also revolving around systems. And so really got engaged in realizing that systems and capacity and bottlenecks and that kind of fun stuff really has helped me understand optometry better, understand healthcare better. And so that's, I think, what we're going to spend a little time talking about today with friction and systems and those kind of fun things.
Yeah, man, what a journey. I feel like we can spend a whole episode just talking about different parts of that journey there, going through Haiti, there's stops and starts, going to Haiti, coming back, having to start over again and get yourself to where you are now. It's pretty amazing. And let's talk a little bit now about that exact topic. Just following some of your content online, following some of the things you're talking about. You talk a lot about operations, a lot about systems. And one of the common themes that you hit home through your experience, because there's a lot of experience that you just mentioned, both in Haiti and now in your own practice, right? Seeing it through the lens of your own practice. You talk about how optometry doesn't have a demand or growth problem. And optometry has a capacity problem, which is interesting because when you look at a lot of the conversations, like in online forums or just in conversations I have, a lot of those conversations are centered around growth. How do we engage more patients? How do we bring more patients in? How do we increase gross revenue? And a lot of times, justifiably, we do need to see revenue coming into the practices, but your contention is not quite. Optometry maybe as a whole doesn't have a growth problem. Optometry has a capacity problem. Yeah. Can you unpack that? What do you mean by that?
It's kind of two-tiered. And so it is the profession and then the individual practices. But both of those are in the same boat. So when you look at overall optometry, I'm talking about capacity versus growth. Capacity-wise, the population is getting older. Our scopes are expanding. We're doing more stuff than we've ever done before. We're having more visits per patient than we've had in the past. And so we've got plenty of opportunity and plenty of patients coming through the door. But a lot of times the issue is not that, it's we don't have enough capacity because we've not changed our systems. We've not changed the patient scheduling. We're not changed how we see patients on the schedule. We're not changed any of the systems that were in place 20 years ago. When I started practicing, when I was that young guy in that practice and there were two older partners and I sat around half the time just trying to think how to get more patients, and that was different. That was a growth thing. I needed to grow my practice. But most practices that I work with and talk to now, they feel like the best way to improve their bottom line is by getting more patients through the door. But if you don't improve the systems before you just get more patients through the door, then your bottom line is really not going to increase like you think it's going to. And you're going to uncover problems that you didn't realize you had because we didn't increase the capacity to handle that growth before we actually just go into getting the growth. So when a lot of times when I talk to doctors, they feel like the number one thing they need is just more patients. But then as we begin to unpack things, we realize it's not just about more patients. There's plenty of patients that are out there, especially as our profession as a whole, because we are doing things that nowadays we didn't do 10 years ago. You look at all of the dry eye advancements and how many times you see the dry eye patients, how much follow-up is required for that. You look at dealing with kids with a myopia progression, how many times we see them versus that one-off eye exam that we would used to do, all the progression of myopia with all the handheld devices and things. So much in our profession is awesome and it's changing and it's growing, it's expanding, it's more exciting than it's ever been. There's opportunities in ways there's never been, but it's not just about the growth that is the problem. It's about we have got to find ways as a profession to make sure that we are able to handle the expansion of the number of patients. And I like you had, I think it was Dr. Edison on a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah. Yeah.
And her talk just about all of doing the remote work and all of that. And that's a huge part of the opportunity when we talk about what we can do to increase our capacity. We've got an optometry school that's actually, I've got a farm about an hour away from here, and right down the road from our farm, they're opening a new optometry school right here in North Carolina to try to increase the number of people in the practice, number of people that are in our profession. So we're doing some things, but I think that's got to be more our conversations, is talking about the systems that sit inside of our practices before we just start bringing a bunch more people through the door. Because as we bring more people through the door, and as we, with all the consultants that we talk to that say you need to be doing this type of practice and that type of practice, if you haven't done other things to shore up your systems, to shore up how your schedule is going to work, how your tech's going to handle it, is the doctor going to become the bottleneck? Are the patients going to be able to get the quality of care that they need to have? Are you just going to speed everything up? How are you going to handle getting more patients through the door to increase that revenue versus getting the systems healthier? And then the revenue itself will kind of come along, especially talking specifically about the bottlenecks and how things happen in my practice. I've learned that, I don't know if you're familiar with, have you ever read the book The Goal by Eliyahu Goldblatt? I can't remember his name. It's really a really cool systems kind of book, sort of one of the gold standard books in systems. And he talks about, he's got the quintessential example that everybody uses for bottlenecks. And he talks about there's a Boy Scout troop, and you got this Boy Scout troop, and they're going on a hike. And the line, instead of staying compacted, the line keeps getting longer and spread out and longer. And so as the scout leader begins to look, he discovers that there's one kid there. His name's Herbie. And so you always hear Herbie. We'll talk about Herbie. Herbie is the slowest one in the pack. And so he is the one that is actually causing the problem. And so what the bottleneck, finding the bottleneck, and then what he did was he took and put Herbie at the front of the line and took a lot of his equipment, a lot of his pack, spread it out among a lot of the other Boy Scouts. And then because of that, he was now able to move faster, be more efficient. The pack stayed together. He was setting the pace. The pace was better. And so all of that kind of comes down to, so when I look at my practice, when I look at things going on, you've got to go in before you start talking about growing and just getting bigger. Like that Boy Scout troop could have doubled their number of Boy Scouts, but it still wouldn't have been any more effective because they had one bottleneck. And so you have to go into your practice before you start talking just about growth and adding numbers, and start looking for Herbies. And so when you first start off, the simple little thing is, the schedule is the herb. That's the bottleneck. That's what's setting the tone of how much revenue you can generate. That's your bottleneck because you're not full. But once the schedule starts getting full, that bottleneck changes. And that's one of the keys of systems thinking, is realizing that it's constantly going to change. You're constantly going to have to be searching to find, where is the Herbie in your practice? What is the thing that is limiting your effectiveness, limiting your potential, limiting your ability to generate the revenue that you're wanting to grow into? Is there's a Herbie in there somewhere? Because the thing that you have to come to understand is your practice, my practice, every system in our lives, it's winning. The system is already at work. It's not a matter of whether or not there's a system at work. There is a system at work in our practices, and it's producing exactly what it was designed to produce. And so the system in my practice is producing exactly what it was designed to produce. And sometimes, man, that stinks, because sometimes what it's producing is not what I want it producing. I do not want discontent staff and disgruntled patients and backups and remakes. That's not the stuff I want it producing. But instead of just saying, who did it? I've learned to say, what system, what is going on in the system that's producing this outcome that I don't like? Yeah. And so, because it's easy to just blame a person, but that becomes just temporary. But when you go in and say, what in the system is producing this outcome, because then that can be changed, and then you can get the outcome that you're looking for. So if the outcome that you're looking for is higher revenue, the low-hanging fruit might be growth, but a lot of times there's a lot of other things in the system that might be your Herbie, that if you go and change just your scheduling. You go and you hire the greatest marketing firm out there. And there's some good ones. And man, there's some that are they can get more patients through the door than you ever dreamed possible. And man, you start just packing them in now you haven't built up the rest of your system with your staff, with your equipment, with the type of exam that you're doing and all those things to maintain and increase that capacity.
And I want to pull the thread on some of these things you've been talking about. And first, let's lean into the pain a little bit, right? So let's imagine we do a really good job of marketing our practices. Patients are coming in, they're becoming aware, they're interested, they want to use your services. What happens when demand is increasing, but capacity can't meet it? In my mind, I just go to, okay, the schedule is being booked out too far. And so patients aren't wanting to wait that long and they decide to go elsewhere. Maybe the patient experience suffers because no one's answering the phones or no one's at the front or paperwork's being processed slowly or whatever it is. Things have to be remade. Lenses have to be remade. The patient experience, the patient care potentially even decreases because things have to move along a little bit too quickly. And I start to think about all those things and the inevitable outcome, if that's happening, well, patients end up going elsewhere anyways.
Absolutely.
Right? You end up losing the demand because the experience is suffering. What do you think about what happens when demand is increasing, but your practice can't handle the capacity?
Yeah. Like I said, the growth without redesign becomes pressure, not progress. If you're just growing, then all you're going to do is build up extra pressure on all of the little points. And so a system that was able to handle 14 patients a day may fully crack at 22 patients a day. And so it's not just about the patient experience, but it's also about that staff experience, that doctor experience, that daily routine experience of, is the system in a way that not only can the patient get quality care, can the patient receive the experience that they want and that they're paying for and that they were marketed by for that great marketing company that said you were the best thing since sliced bread. And man, you're going to give the most comprehensive dry eye evaluation in the history of dry eyes. Not only are you having to deliver on that, but also just on the fact that you've got to be able to handle it as the practitioner. And if you have multiple practitioners in one practice, there's a practitioner's level of fulfillment, because if you increase the growth without redesigning everything, it becomes pressure. And then that pressure becomes an extra level of breaking point for the people involved. And so then your revenue is, again, you're not going to still increase your revenue long term. And you're definitely not going to increase the value of your practice, because what I've found a lot of times too is the other sort of piece that falls into that starts getting into is the doctor or the owner, especially talking about us in private practice, is that owner having to handle everything. Is everything escalating to that one person? Is everything, because if you just get all the people in there, but you've never had to have staff that could solve the questions, solve the problems. When it was 12 patients, 14 patients a day, you may have gotten one or two questions that came up to you that you had to handle other than your practice, the patient encounters. But then when you got twice that many patients, then you're going to have twice those many issues that get escalated up to that owner. And that becomes a pressure point and a bottleneck as well. And so you're right. And so the way that we recommend doing is you start off before you go into just, I need more patients. You go in and you develop a map, a layout of the entire system in your practice. And so the first thing you do is you go in and you find, you got to break it into all the different pieces. And so you find out not just the people, but you find each handoff. And because the handoffs are usually where things, when the pressure gets on. So if you don't redesign and you just get growth and it increases the pressure, where you're usually going to break is with the handoffs. And so it's going to be from the first encounter is your telephone call. So from your telephone call to set the appointment, back when you were seeing 12, that front desk technician or receptionist, she talked to them. She told them everything they could expect to happen. She made sure they got the text or the email with the forms in advance and they were going to know. And she checked their insurance while they were on the telephone and she became friends with them. She knew their kids' names, where they went to elementary school. She got all the information that she needed, made sure that patient was prepared to come to your clinic. Then you ramp things up, though. Things start getting a little busier. You start getting more patients in there because your marketing company did really good. And now all of a sudden, that very first handoff, you start losing momentum because now she doesn't gather all that information. She doesn't make sure, oh, we didn't realize that you had that Blue Cross policy. No, we're not on that panel. Or we didn't realize that you were doing this. And oh, we didn't. No, I'm sorry. No, we're not open to do that. Or no, we don't carry that kind of frame. And stuff that she would have handled before now doesn't get handled in advance. Patient shows up, then there's already friction in the system from that very first handoff before it ever even gets to the patient coming in the door. And then every handoff along the way, from there to the patient arriving, to the initial encounter at the front desk, to the front desk given to the technician, to the doctor, to the optical, every one of those handoffs is what you need to go through before you ever start thinking, I just need to grow my practice. You need to go through and find all of those handoffs and find, okay, what's going to happen to this handoff if we increase our volume? If we have more patients coming through the door, is our system at this handoff able to handle that? Because then you can start improving those handoffs before they start breaking. Because once you get it's not that you only get one shot at it, but if you really do go in, we've seen where practices have gone in, had the marketing, man, and it was just this great influx immediately. Usually it's not just like what we've seen it most of the time has not just been like for routine exams. It was when a practice decided they were going to become really focused on dry eye. And so they went out and they got their Temperature Envy, or they got IPL, or they got these other devices. And man, then that company helps, part of your package when you buy the product, when you buy the piece of equipment, they're going to do this great big marketing scheme for you. And they're going to get you in all your Google reviews and things going on. And so it's not just when it's for regular exams, it's when you take on these specialty types of changing your practice, adding on to what your practice is going to be doing. And the most common, of course, right now we're dealing with are dry eye treatments, aesthetics, adding aesthetics to your practice, adding really intensive myopia control to your practice, or you're really converting. Maybe you've been a little slow to convert to becoming a full medical practice where you're really going to take on glaucoma management. You're really going to take on these other medical types of practice issues. It's usually that's when we start seeing the break, is because it's not just all of a sudden the marketing company says you're going to just do your eye exams. It's when you decide you're going to expand your scope or expand into a specialty area, especially contact lenses. We've seen it when practices decided they're going to do scleral lens fits for the first. They've got a guy, man, he can just fit a scleral lens like you've never seen. He can get it perfect. It is looking good. And those patients are happy with that. And then every cataract surgeon in town, or every person who's ever had an issue with a cornea, sends them all of their patients all at one time. And that 2-hour scleral lens fit changes everything. And so if nothing has changed beforehand, that pressure is going to become a major capacity problem, because they didn't anticipate. They thought the problem was growth. They thought what they needed was a bunch of the patients, but what they didn't realize was that growth can actually be what creates the rupture.
And all of that pressure on the internal side, on the owner and the staff side, on the team side, it leads to stress and burnout, right? Higher turnover on the staff. It leads to a pretty miserable ownership experience for the owner. And a lot of the times when you hear about people just can't wait to get out of their practice and sell or just close down, a lot of the times you hear it's because of burnout like that. They just cannot handle that experience.
Yeah, no doubt. And it's not, and that's so probably the most discouraging part too, is because once you realize you've got all this going on, but then now there's just so much more stress, and what you thought you wanted is exactly what ends up becoming that level of pressure that ends up creating so much, because doctors aren't proud when they burn out. Doctors are ashamed but a lot of times it's not a lack of work ethic. It's not a lack of ability. It's not a lack of knowledge. It's not a lack of desire. It's a broken system. Their system wasn't put in place in a way to help them be able to reach their goals without it being too much pressure. And so you're exactly right. We see it. And especially it's even worse when it's because what you went after, you actually got it. Man, I wanted to be the best scleral lens fitter in the central part of the state. And then you got that. And now all of a sudden, even like in our practice, one of the things that unintentionally happened in our practice was we had a pediatric ophthalmologist in town, just one pediatric ophthalmologist in town that had a huge pediatric ophthalmology practice. All of a sudden decided to leave. Okay. One of that pediatric ophthalmologist's techs was a patient of ours, a friend of ours. So now at the pediatric ophthalmologist's office, they got in contact with the pediatricians in our area that said, no, hey, you can just send them over here to this practice. Okay. We weren't set up to start seeing kids all day, every day, and babies and everything else. We have full scope practice. We see any age, but we weren't set up to where all of a sudden we had this huge influx every day of patients that we weren't equipped to handle. Now, we didn't set out to get it in that particular example, but it still led us to a place where our system couldn't do it. So we had to start evaluating our system. What all in the system has got to change in order to handle this influx of patients or this change in our practice look. And so,
I also just think further downstream, I think of some conversations I've had with associates that are dead set they would never want to own a practice. Part of that is because conversations they've had with burned out and stressed out owners that tell them do not get into practice ownership because they are so burned out and stressed out. And I just wonder how much of that can be changed by creating businesses and practices that run more smoothly and are just more enjoyable to own.
Man, but no, what you said, just creating the practice that runs more smoothly. Okay. So that is the gold standard. And what we're trying to say in that is reduce friction. Small friction creates large failure. That's one of our slogans. It doesn't take a lot of friction points to completely create failure in a way, and failure not meaning like I didn't do it, but just in the system breaking. And you're right. And it's not always, of course, the clinical side that a lot of optometrists, a lot of practicing doctors don't want to deal with. It's not necessarily the clinical side. It's the administrative part.
Administrative, insurance.
Yeah. Insurance stuff, the pre-auth stuff, all the different pieces that go along with it. But you're exactly right. The key is to try to go in before you're overwhelmed with the number of patients that you're seeing and create systems that help you be able to smoothly handle even that part of it. You got to build that into the system. And also it's got part of a lot of that all comes down to on your practice operations part, being too dependent on the owner, too dependent on, like for me. And a lot of that seems like leadership. Like I'm just a good leader. So every time there's a problem, they bring it to me and I solve it. Well, that sounds like good leadership, but that leads to fragility of the practice. And so putting into place systems to where every person on the team is able to own individual pieces of the daily process so that it's not constantly escalated to the owner. And so the optometrist that is the doctor that's practicing, his goal should be, he should be able to practice. He should be able to see patients. And then a lot of the other stuff needs to be able to be handled apart from him. But that doesn't just happen naturally. That's got to be built in.
And you've talked about, and you've written about this sort of dependency ladder of how much the business depends entirely on the owner making decisions, right? Of doing things, doing stuff and making decisions. And talk to us about that. Like, where does that start? How does an owner get out of it? Because at that point, the owner is the bottleneck, right?
Oh, 100%.
How does that work? And how does an owner sort of work out of being so heavily dependent on his or herself to make the practice run?
Yeah. And that's a hard question. That's a big question because there's a whole lot packed into that one little question. But the dependency ladder, when we talk about that, there's 4 rungs of the dependency ladder. And the optometrist, the goal is to get to that 4th rung of the dependency ladder to where the practice does not depend on you every single day to be able to operate as the owner. So talking about the owner and not just to seeing the patients, but the actual owner part. But most practices operate at a much lower rung than they would think they do. Most owners don't understand how much that practice depends on their every day solving little problems, every day taking care of that phone call every day, taking care of that insurance question every day, taking care of that problem with the staff. And so we have to get to a place where there's a couple of things. One, there's like a feedback loop to where the more you solve that problem, the more that the system automatically now that's your problem. So the more often you're willing to answer that question that staff member has, and it's not like you can just all of a sudden decide tomorrow, I'm not going to answer any questions my staff brings to me. Yeah, that's going to be a fun day. Yeah, let's see how your Monday goes when you're there by yourself. But it is coming up to where are those points though? And so we've developed a whole. Actually, it's crazy. Funny you ask. Just today, or we got a manuscript back from the editor for a book that's about that exact thing on the practice that'll be being released, but that you've got an assessment where you can have a full assessment done of asking questions about in a normal day, how many things get escalated to that level where the owner is having to solve the problem. How many things and we'll break it down into all the different categories, where it's a communication problem, whether it is a technical problem, whether it is, for a long time when I first got into practice, I used to do my dad was an engineer. And so I grew up building computers with my dad. And so did a lot of the computer repair and those things. I did that all the way through college. And so when I first got into practice, I thought it was the greatest thing. And my senior partners thought it was great when we first started automating everything. It was like, man, Kerry can fix all of it. Hey, every time a computer didn't print, I come out with a patient and they're like, hey, you got to come up front. The computer's not printing. You got to come over here to the optical department because we can't send this to the lab because we lost internet. And so I became that guy. And so that's an extreme example, but I've learned that's been the way all the way through though. Even now is I can't be the person who, if the phone's not working, I can't be the person that's got to solve that. If the internet goes down, I can't be the person that the owner, because that's not where my value is. My value is not even collecting data. You got to get to a place where the doctor, and that's what we talked about with the capacity part, is you've got to get to the doctor needs to be analyzing data and coming up with a plan and then handing that off to other staff members. And when we start talking about artificial intelligence, that's the place where artificial intelligence kicks in, is helping the doctor be the person who interprets data and develops the plan. And then the rest is handled by everybody else. And that is not just who's going to fix the computer, but that's also in the day of a doctor being able to, we used to, when I first got into practice, we would buy retiring doctors' practices. And so doctor would give them an exit strategy, would buy their practice, and then would if they wanted to, they could still work a couple days a week. And then we would bring in a young doctor that would cover a couple of those doctors' practices. And some of those doctors, they were doing absolutely everything. The patient would come through the door, they'd greet them at the front, they would take them back, they would do the pre-testing, they would do the exam, they would fit them with glasses. And when they came back in, they'd dispense them. And those days are just long gone if you're going to be able to have a practice that is able to be sustained in today's market. And if you're going to actually, that goes back in something we won't even be able to touch on much today, is just the value of your practice. Yes. The most valuable practices are those doctors that are on rung 4 of the dependency ladder. When somebody's coming in to look at the value of your practice, the more that practice depends on you, the less valuable your practice is.
Absolutely.
And so that helped me really come to a place of realizing, as I would start recognizing, okay, this particular problem has came to me a whole lot of times over the last month. So I've got to find where in the system is that not working, because I can't be solving that problem because that decreased the value of my practice. If I'm the one that has to solve that problem every time, I'm hurting the value of my practice. And so that's really helped me be just my standard of, hey, I can't do that. I want my practice to be as valuable as it can be. So of course that's the top line, and then that's the bottom line, but that's not your only things that's going to determine the value of your practice. I don't care if you're trying to sell eventually to a big group, whether you're trying to sell to another optometrist, whether you're trying to sell to venture capitalists. The more that practice depends on you, then the less valuable it is. And that all comes down to, are you a system-driven practice or a personality-driven practice?
Yeah.
And so many practices are personality-driven, and that hurts.
I couldn't agree more. It's going to impact the value of the business as well as the risk of the business. The more the practice depends on you, the more risk there is to the business in case something happens to you and you cannot go into work the next day. And so the less your practice relies on you in the day-to-day operations, the more valuable, as we talked about, it's going to be to another buyer that can just step in and run it very easily. But also, the more you protect your business from something happening to you and still continuing to see patients through a variety of different ways. And a part of it, just hearing you talk, it sounds like a part of it is just also just being aware that there are things that are the best use of your time, you meeting the owner doctor. There are things that are the best use of your time in the business that really drive the business forward. And there are things that are not. And even just being aware of that and maybe just listing out those things can help someone say, oh my goodness, these things are coming up constantly that I need to answer or do. I shouldn't be doing that. Maybe it's just that awareness of, okay, it's costing my business for me to be spending my time doing these things. There's someone out there better than me that can do this more quickly than me and maybe enjoys it more than I do. Let's let that person in my business do that. I need to focus on seeing patients and growing my practice. And I want to make this maybe even a little bit more concrete. We talk about systems, we talk about bottlenecks. You've mentioned some of them already. The biggest ones potentially being at handoffs. Where do patients move from one person to another or one step to another in the practice? Yeah. How does someone really look at their business, look at the way it's running, the systems, as we say, like the list of steps of everything that's happening, and find those bottlenecks and know where to start first? How should they do that?
Yeah, the first thing, and so what you're asking is, how do you find Herbie? Okay, that's the easy way in my mind to think about it. Where's Herbie?
There you go. Yeah. Where's Herbie?
Right now? Where's Herbie in my practice right now? And the very first thing is you got to realize there is a Herbie in your practice. There is something that is a bottleneck. There's something that is limiting your potential for growth, for profitability, for just the smoothness of your practice flowing. So no matter what your goal is, because we think there's not a bottleneck in how many patients I see or how much money I'm generating. It's not even just about that. It's just what is limiting your practice from being the best practice it can be for you, for your patients, for your staff. And so the first is just realizing there are things that are bottlenecks. And of course, the simple ones, low-hanging fruits, just getting enough patients, filling the schedule, marketing. But for most practices that are mature, that's no longer the bottleneck. The bottleneck, a lot of times it becomes at your pre-testing. So you've got to start looking at pre-testing. What is my capacity at pre-testing? How much do patients back up at pre-testing? Where are patients having to wait? Where are patients having to stop in the flow for the longest period of time? Which means you have to start assessing those things. You have to say, okay, from the time the patient walks in the door, it took them this amount of time for them to get all their paperwork and get everything ready for them to be taken back. And then from that point, once they were taken back, how long was it before they were into the doctor's exam room and then seen by the doctor? And one of the easy things to kind of check out is time, of course, is your flow. So where's the bottleneck in your time flow? And then that can be, a lot of times it's pre-testing, a lot of times it's doctor time, which we don't like to talk about it being our fault, but sometimes it is our fault. And so a lot of times it's the doctor's fault. Optical can be, if there's an issue with being able to get them into optical when they're supposed to, getting them to check out. A lot of times the backup will be at the checkout desk. I know that's one of the things that I struggle with, is getting to where we get the checkout flowing at a healthy rate. A lot of times the bottleneck can be stuff like no-shows. You don't even think about no-shows as being a bottleneck, but if you're talking about just the effectiveness of your daily routine, man, no-shows can be a huge bottleneck that needs to be addressed. And there's a lot of ways to address no-shows, but you've got to first realize that is your bottleneck. A lot of times it's follow-through. When you talk about, when you're not talking about just getting the patient in and getting the patient out, but if you talk about outcomes, what is keeping us from achieving the highest level of outcomes with our patients? A lot of times it's the follow through. We don't do a good job of setting up systems for follow through. Instead of doing, in the iCoin thing we're building, the software, they're called iCare plans, where you plug a patient into a plan that gets them every step from the time I recommend it to the time we achieve the desired outcome. Everything is my fault. Everything is on us. Everything is on the system, not on the patient. Because in the past, what we would do is if a patient didn't follow through, or they were just non-compliant. I mean, that's just our easy throw it. If a patient didn't do their glaucoma drops, they're non-compliant. If a patient didn't do their hot compresses and lid scrubs and drops 17 times a day and everything else they're supposed to do that I told them was going to be best for them, if they don't do it, they're just non-compliant. And so it's easy to abscond ourselves from that responsibility versus saying, maybe they weren't, maybe they were living regular life and regular life got in the way of them because we didn't help them with a system once they left our office. We've always said we get maybe 2 hours out of the year, and then they got the other 8,000 hours that we don't have anything to do with, but that's not true. We can actually take responsibility, take ownership of more of those hours. And so a lot of times the follow through is the bottleneck to our outcomes. But a lot of times outcomes aren't near as cool as bottom lines. You know what I'm saying? Outcomes aren't as cool as dollars. Right. You know what I'm saying? But if we really want to talk about the most effective practice and the most engaging practice and the practice that's accomplishing the most success, then you've got to take into account the patient outcomes, because that does affect your bottom line. Because that patient that came to you with dry eye and your recommendation was, this is the best drop. Go down to CVS, buy this little bottle of drops, use it 4 times a day. And then thinking that's going to fix that patient's dry eye. It's not. They're not going to get it. They're not going to use it. There's a whole lot better ways we can build systems to help them accomplish it. And so they're not coming back to you. And if they do come back to you because they like you, they're certainly not going to tell their neighbors how great a dry eye doctor you are. And so that even the follow through has a huge part, even in your bottom line.
That is interesting. As someone who also gives advice for a living, I've come to realize my advice is only as good as the impact it has on the optometrist family I'm serving, right? And if there is no follow through, if I'm not helping lead through the follow through, then my advice was almost worthless to a point, right? It really didn't do anything positively for the family. And I've found it's sometimes difficult to look at myself and say, I probably should have done better to do that, even when the advice that we give as professionals is correct and accurate, and it was the right thing. If the outcome doesn't follow, it's perceived by the patient anyways that the advice wasn't sound, right? That's still going to be the perception if the outcomes don't follow. And it sounds like this process of getting out of the exam lane and looking at how everything's working and seeing where patients are delayed or piling up, or where information's delayed or piling up. It seems like that's an ongoing process, that these bottlenecks, as you mentioned, just move around. It's almost whack-a-mole a little bit, right? You fix one, things improve, and then that leads us to the next one, right? You just have to continuously improve, it sounds like. Is that right?
Oh, so true. Yeah, Herbie never stays in one place.
Herbie, come on.
Come on, Herbie. And as you grow, everything changes with growth. And so everything is going to be at a different place. What worked in the practice when it was smaller is not going to necessarily work as it gets bigger. And it may be a totally different place that becomes the bottleneck, that becomes that hang up spot. And whether it would be on the follow through or depending too much on me. So it is. Oh, Herbie keeps moving on around. You got to keep tracking him down if you want to be as effective as you can be, as have a practice that runs as smoothly as it can, and you continue to build the maximum value in your practice. Then you've got to constantly be readjusting for bottlenecks.
The question that might come up is, maybe I just need to hire more staff. Maybe I just need to hire another associate. Maybe I just need a better EHR, better tools, better technology. What do you say to that?
I say, if that's your Herbie, then you're right.
Gotcha.
But if it's not your Herbie, it doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter what else you fix. Then it's not gonna improve. Think back to Herbie in that line with the scouts. You can take and give all of them better shoes, but it's still not going to make any difference. You can bring on an extra scout leader, and they still not going to go any faster unless you address the actual bottleneck. And so unless what you're adding is actually the bottleneck, then it's not going to help. And because what I've learned too, and through mistakes, is that you've got to address the whole. The whole is much more than just the sum of the parts. And actually improving one part can make the whole worse. Just if you increase one thing without it being the bottleneck or without addressing the rest of what might be issues, then it can actually make the whole system be worse, even though you optimized one area of the system. If you optimize your checkout, but you don't fix everything else along the way, then you're still going to be stuck with the same kind of problems that you had, except you got a really cool checkout now.
Interesting. Out of respect of your time, I want to ask you about one more thing. And this wouldn't be a podcast if I didn't ask you about AI. And I want to talk about AI because there's a lot of talk. There's a lot of doom and gloom talk in some places about how AI, artificial intelligence, and that sounds like pie in the sky, this big dark cloud up there. Let's just say AI tools. AI tools will impact knowledge workers, will impact professionals. How do you feel AI will impact optometry?
Yeah, it's going to completely eliminate optometry, and we're not going to any of us have jobs. Yeah,
And we'll wrap up there. No.
Yeah. No, and you're exactly right. There's so much just of trying to take things to extreme levels. I think AI is going to have a huge impact on optometry. I think it's going to have a huge impact on all of healthcare, of course, but it's not going to eliminate optometry. It's not going to eliminate the need for the doctor to be in the system. What it should do is remove friction. So not replace care, but remove friction. And I think that the people that use AI and build AI, that's what's going to be their focus. The real threat to the doctor-patient relationship is not AI. It's the same stuff that's been the threat for the last 20 years. It's all the insurance issues. It's all of the prior authorization stuff. It's having the EHR driving you crazy that you're having to spend all evening trying to put stuff into charts. It's the things that burn out optometrists and keep them from being in front. So the goal of AI should be to eliminate that. So the goal of AI should be just to actually take us back to where we used to be able to spend that time just in front of the patient and engaging the patient and helping them to understand what their needs are and how we're going to help them achieve the outcome that we both want. And so hopefully the goal of AI is going to be to eliminate those things that get us back into being there in front of the patient. And it is going to be involved in things like data collection, data interpretation, as far as helping the doctor know what this particular piece of data looks like or it means. And then the doctor's job is going to still always be judgment and deciding how does that impact the patient? How does that impact the outcome we're searching for and pushing towards? And because we don't need more noise in the system. We've got plenty of noise in the system. We don't need that. We need to use AI to help reduce the amount of noise so that we can be doing what we need to be doing, which is helping patients achieve better outcomes.
I love that. Human trust, human judgment, human wisdom will always be sought after, in my opinion as well, especially where there's high value decisions to be made. And I'd say our vision, our sight is a pretty high value decision in order to take care of our eyes. I absolutely agree, especially where there's a lot of information. People need to know what to do with it and how to use it appropriately in wisdom and good human professional judgment. I couldn't agree more. And let's make this more concrete. It sounds like you see AI being used both in the clinical side as well as operationally. What are some examples of how you see AI improving the way that practice is run?
I think definitely we'll end up with AI scribing, to where instead of the doctor having to manually enter data in the exam room, that'll be done with artificial intelligence, doing scribing, doing a lot of phone answering, triaging phone calls, triaging patients when they call of what needs to be done, and that's already happening. Our practice already has where when you call in, the AI can tell where the phone call needs to go to, what needs to be the next step in the process. That'll just become more and more effective in saving time for the doctor and for the staff. There are already programs that we use with AI that's interpreting optos photographs to see some little microaneurysms, and then not only seeing those microaneurysms, but then saying, okay, these are some differentials for what we're seeing in this photo. And then the doctor takes and helps to determine what exactly caused that and what needs to be done about it. So all those things are already out there. The AI is already available. It's already being implemented. And so doctors that are not engaging that where it is are going to definitely find themselves behind a really fast moving change if they're not willing to embrace AI. If they don't embrace AI because they say they're believing the doom and gloom that it's just going to replace all optometrists, and so the way to stop it from replacing optometrists is we just keep it out of optometry. Yeah, those people are going to be left behind, in my opinion, because I believe that's an irrational viewpoint and a viewpoint that's going to cause a lack of progress.
Where do you feel like AI is maybe oversold or overhyped in optometry, or may actually negatively impact the patient experience?
Well, I think that if you do see some people pushing a little harder on, like I was reading where in a rural community, where they were going to be using AI to almost do the eye exam and then a doctor just sign off on it. I think that that's taking it to an extreme when you start taking the doctor out of the doctor-patient relationship and all of it is AI based, and then the doctor is only there almost as a rubber stamp kind of scenario. That's dangerous. That's dangerous because can AI perform a routine eye exam and get a refraction that might work? Well, sure, it can. Even at this point, even with the amount of AI we have now, it could perform a rudimentary eye exam. But how many patients do we see every single day? That's what they thought they needed. And it turned out being a whole lot more than that. They thought all they wanted was to renew their AccuView contact lens prescription, and they didn't realize they had a retinal tear or they had these other things going on, or even something more obscure where they didn't realize that their thyroid condition was setting them up for having this particular problem with their ocular surface, and they don't have all the signs and symptoms at the moment, but we realize they're starting to go to that direction, and we need to help educate them on that and take them into a healthier place for better outcomes. That's the kind of thing that you're not going to see with just having AI do all of it.
We've talked about a lot today. This has been a phenomenal conversation for me. I'm even learning a lot as we speak, thinking about my own business too. This has been helpful for me. What are some final thoughts you'd want to leave with the listeners?
Just basically, that is, if you're as an optometrist, just continue to love the practice. And if you've got things in your practice that are the parts that you don't like, the parts that seem like they're the friction points, where there's things you can do about it. There's things that, don't just take the short, easy route of blaming an individual or blaming a particular position. Start trying to look at your practice more and saying, okay, what system is producing this outcome? Because what I always like to say is the system is winning. So the system in your practice is winning. The system that was put in place either intentionally or unintentionally, that system is winning. And so if you're not getting the outcome you want, don't let that discourage you to the point where you are getting burned out or you are wanting to hang up doing what you're doing. We need good optometrists still in there for the long haul. And so instead, let's find ways that you can investigate your system, find out what's going on in those systems. And because the systems are changeable. That's the best thing about it, is when you find out what the problem is, those things can be changed. And a lot of times it's a lot simpler than you think it is. And so just keep working on making that better. Don't get into putting your practice on a place of being unhealthy because you're worried too much about artificial intelligence or doom and gloom stuff or clickbait issues. That's how they get you to look in there, is telling you how bad it all is. So so just hang in there, keep doing what we're doing, because we've got the best profession ever, man. We've got a profession that changes people's lives. It creates a great living for us that do it. Rarely do we have patients die. Occasionally, but not often, are we the cause of that. And so we've got the best profession ever. And so don't let something come in that's going to cause you to be discouraged and forget that when it's something that could have been fixed.
I appreciate you saying that. And I think that's a great place to end. Where can listeners find and follow and learn more about what you're doing?
But LinkedIn is probably the easiest, under Kerry Reeves OD. Like I said, we've got a book that'll be released soon, but LinkedIn is the easiest place to kind of see what kind of rambling I'm rambling about.
Gotcha. I will throw a link to all that in the show notes. Once the book's out, I'll throw a link to the book in there as well. I really appreciate you coming on. This has been a great conversation, and I think the listeners are going to get a lot out of it. For the listener, appreciate you listening. We will catch you on the next episode. In the meantime, take care.
Want more resources to help master your money? Check out the Education Hub on Evon's website at optometrywealth.com. Evon Mindren is a certified financial planner and owner of Optometry Wealth Advisors, a California registered investment advisor. All opinions of Evon and his guests are their own. This show is for informational purposes only and should not be relied on for specific investment, legal, tax, or other decisions. Clients of OWA may own securities mentioned on this show.